Okay, assalamu alaikum everyone. So it's my pleasure to welcome everyone here. And hopefully, inshallah, this will be a series of seminars on Islamic philosophy where the goal is to introduce Muslims to philosophical thinking. So today it's our pleasure to have Dr. Faris Abdel-Hadi, who will be talking about his recent book on Shaykh al-Akbar's Muhammad Ibn Arabi's religious pluralism. And yeah, thank you, Faris, and you can start now. Yeah, thanks.
Right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for hosting me, Si Boumediene. And welcome to all of you. And good evening or good morning, depending on the time zone you're in. Uh, my name is Faris Abdel-Hadi, and this will be a presentation about a book I hope will be published by the end of this year, hopefully. It is a reworked version of a PhD thesis I completed under the supervision of Professor Sajjad Rizvi. And it's basically a discussion about Ibn Arabi's take on the other religions apart from Islam. What does he have to say about them? And what are his views on religious pluralism? Pre-orders are available by the end of November, and you should be able to purchase the book sometime in late December. So please do order a copy from your libraries if you can. I apologize for the pricing in advance. Hopefully there'll be a cheaper version sometime in the future. So now I'll be giving this presentation to a group of academics and specialists in the field, but I also realize that there will be people who may not be familiar with the subject or the person being presented here. So I just want to give a brief background on him. And if at any time you cannot hear me or if something's not clear, please do let me know. And we'll leave questions in general till the end of the presentation, along with the panelists. Thank you very much. So why Ibn Arabi? Well, as people in the field will know, Ibn Arabi is one of the most prominent figures to appear in the intellectual tradition in Islam over the past 800 years. And he provides insights, very creative and profound discussions on the nature of being and therefore by extension, the being of other religions. And so his writings, his thoughts, his discussions are very relevant to today's world in general. And this also, of course, includes what is known as the wider Akbarian school of thought, or the individuals who subscribe to some of the Sheikh's teachings without necessarily agreeing with him on every point, but they will use some of his concepts in one way or another. And so it seems to me that his writings and his concepts and his ideas can be used to build bridges between Islam and many other religions, including the non-Abrahamic religions in particular. And I think this is no exaggeration. So this book was written for academics and specialists in the field, but I have tried to make it as accessible to non-specialists as possible. But I do think that this topic deserves a book that can be read by everyone in the near and sometime in the future when I'm able to write it. So therefore, as a slight caveat before we begin, just to note that this book may presume a little bit of prior knowledge to Ibn Arabi and what might be called his metaphysics. So if you've read previous works, it would help to understand the book better. But I do try to explain everything along the way. Additionally, Ibn Arabi's metaphysics has been explained quite proficiently by previous scholars, so there's no need for me to go into that in the book. So the book is more concerned with the way his metaphysics is applied through the filter of the Sharia and how they can be applied and joined together. This is an area which is lacking in the field. And so this is what I try to focus on in the book. So more specifically, the book is concerned with the problem of the image of Ibn Arabi. Some scholars will read him as an exclusivist, and other scholars will read him as an inclusivist. So I am concerned as to why this contradiction exists. And it tends to revolve around one particular passage, which I've called the solar metaphor. And it is a well-known passage in the field. So I try to address the problem of being binary or approaching Ibn Arabi in a very dualistic or binary fashion, which is to say whether he is either an exclusivist or an inclusivist. It is not as simple as that. I do not believe the matter is as simple as that. I think he's actually both. And I'll try to explain how this is so in a minute. And so the point will be to create some kind of a model of Weberian pluralism that takes both views into account on the basis of the solar metaphor. So then this raises the question as to what exactly is the solar metaphor. And so it is this passage which comes from chapter 339 of the Futuhat. And the passage is thus: all the revealed religions, Sharia, are lights. Among these religions, the revealed religion of Muhammad is like the light of the sun among the lights of the stars. When the sun appears, the lights of the stars are hidden, and their lights are included in darajat, in the light of the sun. So their being hidden is like the abrogation of the other revealed religions that takes place through Muhammad's revealed religion. Nevertheless, they do in fact exist, just as the existence of the light of the stars is actualized. This explains why we have been required in our all-inclusive religion to have faith in the truth of all messengers and all the revealed religions. They are not rendered null or batil by abrogation. That is the opinion of the ignorant. And so the rest of the book is dedicated to trying to explore this passage in more detail and to understand why is there this contradictory projection of Ibn Arabi's message as to being either an exclusivist or inclusivist. And the short answer is that two things are happening simultaneously in the metaphor, and I'll explain that in a minute. That's what the first two chapters are dedicated to with regard to the solar metaphor. The third chapter takes a look at a very important publication that was published relatively recently by an important scholar named Gregory Lipton on Ibn Arabi with regard to his religious pluralism, which takes a more exclusivist understanding of Ibn Arabi. And I critique that model, and we'll see why as well when we come to that chapter. And then the rest of the book is dedicated to seeing how does Ibn Arabi include the other religions, particularly the non-Abrahamic religions, under the fold of Islam and its, I suppose, many-fold extenuating mechanisms. So let's get started with the first chapter, if we're good to go on that. So, well, the question is, what is going on in the solar metaphor? Well, it's a two-part process, but in order to understand what is happening, we'd have to do a little bit of a painstaking investigation and try and find other passages that are similar to this one and are comparable to one another. I will not be going into a legal analysis of what abrogation is, because I think that is relatively less important in the grander scheme of things, because for Ibn Arabi, abrogation is more or less, with regard to Muhammad's law, is a cosmic event. And just in case I'm going a bit too fast, and people don't know what the word abrogation means, the word abrogation means to annul a previous law, more or less, to give it a simple definition. So Muhammad's religion will annul and cancel the previous laws that came before him, as his own Sharia emerges when he himself is born. That is the traditional understanding in Islam. But for Ibn Arabi, abrogation is also a cosmic event that occurs when something called the Muhammadan reality, al-Haqiqa al-Muhammadiyya, which is a transcosmic reality, manifests itself through the birth of Muhammad. And then I'll explain what that means as well. And so we will ultimately come down to a framework where we discuss something called the divine message, al-Risalat al-Muhammadiyya, and subsequently a subset of that, the Muhammadan message, which is al-Risalat al-Muhammadiyya. Now, let's just go very quickly into the definition of abrogation. We can find a simple definition in the works of certain usuliyun, practitioners of the principles and foundations of legal jurisprudence, like Imam al-Juwayni and his commentator Al-Mahalli. So he says, firstly, abrogation means really disappearance. So he uses that in a sentence as Shamsu nasakhat al-dhilla, right? Like, for example, the sun abrogates the tree's shadow, for example, i.e. it cancels it out, which is called al-zawal. So it disappears. The second meaning is to transfer. So, for example, one says, huwa nasakh al-kitab, right? Which means he copied the book from which we get the nuskha, a copy of a book. We still use that word today in Arabic. It's a copy of something. So if you're going to copy a book, you're transferring the contents of the old book into a new book. And that's called copying, the transfer of contents. So Ibn Ārabī accepts both definitions. But there's a third definition not given in Imam Juwayni's work, but Ibn Ārabī accepts it as well, and it's given by the Arabic dictionaries nevertheless. And it is the near homonym masakh. So masakh resembles nasakh, which means metamorphosis, transformation. So Ibn Ārabī uses all three definitions. Now, in the first chapter, I go through a number of passages and compare them to one another, but we're not going to do that for this presentation. We'll keep it nice and short, and this is just one example, one passage, which reads thus. So here he is talking about what is called the subahat, and that might be translated as the facial glories of God, according to a hadith which says God has 70,000 veils of light. Were he to lift just one veil, the whole of creation would burn. So then Ibn Ārabī comments, this quote-unquote burning away means it is the inclusion of the lower light in the higher light, like the inclusion of the light of the stars and the light of the sun. So the lower light doesn't just disappear. Thus, when a star comes under the sun's rays, it is said that it was quote-unquote burnt away, even though the light continues to exist in the essence of the star. So by burning away is not meant non-existence, but rather the change of one entity's state as seen by the viewer. Hence, its name passes away from it through the passage of the property. The wood was wood, as another example, but when it was burnt away, it was called coal, even though the substance is one. It is known that the stars keep their brightness in themselves, but we do not perceive it because of the weakness of perception. So this is a clear example of metamorphosis, where the wood is transformed or is metamorphosed into coal. So from these passages, in summary, we can conclude that something must necessarily disappear or become annihilated. That much is clear. And this is what the divine message of Risalat al-Ilahiyya is all about, including the Muhammadan message by extension. So what is the divine message? The divine message encompasses all beings in creation, in which God communicates with them, and so burdens them with the obligation to respond to his commands or prohibitions. So when Ibn Ārabī says that it includes all beings, he doesn't just mean human beings or jinn. He means literally all beings, like from all four kingdoms, plants, animals, minerals, rocks, water, trees, stars, and so on. How is that possible? Well, Ibn Ārabī, as a mystic, is capable of doing something called kashf, which is unveiling. So when he lifts the veil, he sees that in reality, in a mystical state, that all things are actually alive, and all things are actually knowing, have will, and a certain degree of power, even if it's so faint that we cannot perceive it. So, and even they speak and they hear. So these are called the mother attributes in his metaphysics, and they all are in possession of that. So if they're all in possession of that, it follows that they are tasked by God to respond to his own messages, especially when they exist in something called communities or So in chapter 367 of the Futuhat, he says, the messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, said regarding dogs, they are one of the communities. Thus the divine message encompasses all the communities, small and great. Therefore, there is no community except that it comes under a divine address, khitab ilahi, upon the tongue of a warner sent to it from it and within it. And then he also says the beasts are one of those communities. And so if they are one of those communities, us as human communities, from the Islamic point of view, human beings, we have messengers and prophets and saints, wiser and higher beings who surpass us, and they guide us well. The same implication is taken for all other beings as well. They have their own prophets, they have their own messengers, they have their own saints, whether it's cats, dogs, bees, or trees. So then, as an example, in the second chapter of the Futuhat, he says, beasts are not obliged to believe except in their own animal messengers. So when they knew Solomon's power and believed in him, they were given the portion of the mercy granted to humans. Now, the discussion is wider than this, because one needs to show how exactly does taklif exists for other beings. Where is it in the Quran? Where is it in the Sunnah? I won't get into that in this presentation, but it's in the book. Now, angels have their own communities as well. Jinn have their own communities. Even the cosmological letters of the alphabet, their arwah, spirits, have their own communities. And if you're wondering what that is, just ask me at the end of the presentation. So they have their own messengers, prophets, and saints. So Ibn Arabi further says explicitly, this prophethood, nubuwah, flows through animals too, Sariya, just like his word resulted. And thy Lord revealed to the bees. So that means they have revelation, and all of them are of this sort. The same thing is mentioned in Surah Zilzala, the 99th surah of the Quran, when God says that He'll inspire the earth to speak. Now, with regard to human beings, who are they obligated to respond to? So Ibn Arabi mentions an interesting thing when he says that before the time of Noah, people were free to follow any prophet. They were not obliged to enter into a particular law of a prophet. They could choose to do so or not to do so. But after Noah's time, it became an obligation to follow the law of a particular prophet, which explains why Khidr did not have to follow Moses, because Moses had his own law. But Khidr, the green man, if you like, was following the law of another prophet. And this is in reference to the 18th surah of the Quran, when Khidr performs a series of actions that are distasteful to Moses, and he's completely shocked by them. So it is only Muhammad's law that is universally abrogating. So what happens when Muhammad's law arrives? Well, Ibn Arabi quotes a dictum, which he believes in, which says that the ulama, the scholars, or the knowers of God, more precisely, the knowers of this community are akin to the prophets of Israel. In other words, they legislate for their communities the same way the prophets of Israel legislate for their communities. They legislate law. So then this raises the question, these ulama, technically he calls them prophet saints, can they legislate a ruling that is contrary to Muhammad's law? And the answer may surprise you. He says yes and no. If it is from one's opinion, ra'i, then no. Ra'i means one's personal opinion. It's not founded in law. But as for yes, the person belonging to the Shafi'i madhab can make a ruling that goes against a person who belongs to the Hanafi madhab. But both of them come from the law of Muhammad because he has confirmed both rulings. So it's as if you've got multiple laws that are contained under one grand overarching law. So Ibn Arabi, as if he's speaking to you, says, فَأَنْتَ خَالَفْتَ شَرْعَهُ بِشَرْعِهِ. So therefore, you disagreed with or you contravened Muhammad's law, but through his law. And that's permissible. Well, when we're talking about the different madahib. It's as if you got multiple laws that are encompassed by Muhammad's one grand overarching law. And then Ibn Arabi also goes on to say that these are the people who preserve the rulings of Muhammad within his community. And that includes other figures, like the tabi'een, tabi'at and then people like Sufyan Thawri, Ibn Abi Rabah, and so on and so forth. And there are people who preserve his secrets, his spiritual states, as asrar, like Ali bin Abi Talib, Salman Farisi, even Sharif al-Radi, Abu Hurairah, and so on and so forth. So the divine message then says that all beings are obligated with responding to it with the taklif that's prescribed upon them. So the Muhammadan message in turn says, and Ibn Arabi takes a very normative approach to this, being in line with the Islamic tradition, when he says that all human beings are obligated with responding to Muhammad's call. And that's based on a number of Quranic verses and hadith, like for example, when it's mentioned in the Quran, "O you who believe in God and his messenger." So for Ibn Arabi, the Prophet Muhammad being the last prophet to come, he encompasses all the laws that come before him, which makes his message universal and therefore universally abrogating. So Ibn Arabi gives us this image, this picture, when he says, "He was like the brilliant sun in all lights became included in daraja, in his shining light, and all properties or rulings became concealed within his property. All the laws became subservient to him, and his mastery, which was previously hidden, became manifest. And then you've got other lines in the Quran like, we have not sent thee except to all people, kafat al-nas. So since Muhammad's mission encompasses the whole of mankind, and so does his law, and by implication, the roots of the law, as well as the practical legal application of the law, the furu', the whole of mankind is addressed and responsible for answering to whatever the law brings. So Ibn ʿArabī says this quite explicitly in chapter 68, when he says, our position is that all people, every single believer, and everyone else is prescribed and addressed with following and applying the roots of the Sharia, which are the foundational principles, as well as its practical branches. And they'll be taken to task on the day of judgment for the roots and the branches. So he takes a relatively normative view when it comes to abrogation. And he subscribes to other normative views, like he believes in the doctrine of tahrif, which is the doctrine of, corruption. He believes that the previous scriptures have been altered and corrupted from their original state. And he also says in the Ijaz al-Bayan that Muhammad was mentioned in the previous scriptures, which is a normative Islamic view rooted in the Quran itself. So what that means is that by rejecting Muhammad, you could be rejecting your own prophet. So he believes in all those views which corresponds to this principle of annihilation. And he also even criticizes the act of Muslim women and in Damascus taking their children to have holy water sprinkled on their children. So in conclusion, the divine message obligates all beings with obeying God, and the Muhammadan message obligates humans with responding to Muhammad's call. By the way, note that doesn't mean becoming a conventional Muslim, not necessarily. And I'll come to that in a minute. So the solar metaphor necessarily includes this mechanism of annihilation, of making something disappear. And so the religions are undeniably annihilated in some manner, but this raises the question as to what? And that leads us into the second chapter, which is subsistence, because subsistence and annihilation are correlative twins. They are correlative terms. Nothing is annihilated absolutely. So if you're annihilated from one thing, you subsist in another thing. So subsistence is always there. And this might be something that people tend to forget. So Ibn ʿArabī mentions, but nevertheless, no entity of the stars is gone. And by burning away is not meant non-existence. But in actual fact, they have not been annihilated. Not really, not totally, and so on and so forth. So then the question we need to ask ourselves is, if the stars do remain, then how so? If the previous religions do remain in some manner, then this raises the question as to how so. So therefore, there are two main themes of this chapter, which is the jizya, which means the poll tax that is paid by religious minorities to the Islamic State, historically speaking, and rahma, which is mercy, one of the foundational principles of Ibn Arabi's methodology. So he says, whenever we discuss this is what I say. Whenever we discuss the jizya, do bear in mind that there's a presumption of two parties being in a state of war and disagreement, right? And I think that's really important, and we'll see why in the third chapter. And it raises another question. Is humiliation an intrinsic part of the jizya? And these questions are raised with regard to one verse of the Quran, which talks about the jizya. And Gregory Litton believes that it is an intrinsic part of the jizya. I personally don't think that humiliation is an intrinsic part of it, and I go into it in the book. But very briefly, what Ibn Arabi says about the poll tax is that it has the function of absorbing other religious minorities into the Islamic State and including them within its fold. And this is what has happened historically speaking. They would pay the poll tax and they'd be allowed to practice their own religion. So by means of payment of the tax, they are free to practice their own religion. But for Ibn Arabi, this has an extra value when he says that it actually means that it also has a salvific value. When they pay the jizya, they're also saved in the next life. So the verse in question says, those who were given the book. So who were those who were given the book? The Ahl al-Kitab, we call them, the people of the book, which normally means Jews and Christians, but I think there's also interpretation that could include other religions like Hindus as well. I think that might have been a question that was addressed during the Mughal period. So those who were given the book, when they paid the indemnity tax by hand in a state of being humbled, most humbled. So when they do that, then they become included in the Islamic polity. I talk about the tax because it is the primary way in which the other religions have become included in the Islamic polity. I think it's completely incorrect to say that it is the only way, and I'll show that in a minute. But because it's important, and it was one of the primary means of including them, I do need to talk about it a little bit. Now, the second chapter goes into how the verse functions, 929, which is the jizya verse. So I try to contextualize it within the context of the surah itself, then within the wider Quran. What does Maliki fiqh during the time of Ibn ʿArabī have to say about it? And then within the Futuhat and the Fusus al-Hikam, which are his books. But we won't get into the details of that right now, because there wouldn't be enough time to do so. But very briefly, yes, some people think that the Sabians, Zoroastrians, and so on are also people of the book, but that would raise the question as to where they given the book, right? الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ, right? So then, were they given divinely revealed books? But I think like on a literal reading, right? I'm just answering a question here. On a literal reading, I think that's very interesting because Ibn Arabi's methodology is to read the Quran somewhat literally. So one could say, like for example, a Hindu might say, well, I was given the Vedas and the Upanishads. So then that would make you from the الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ, right? So Ibn Arabi's position as to what the purpose of the jizya is that it is a means for sparing their lives, because remember, jizya is a tax that is implemented in war, right? So when there's two warring parties, if the Muslims are victorious, then they impose the jizya tax on the other religious minorities who were defeated. So the Quranic commentators have a number of views as to why the jizya is imposed, but I think the opinion of Ibn Rushd al-Jad, the grandfather of the Ibn Rushd who Ibn Arabi meets, Ibn Rushd al-Hafid. So Ibn Rushd al-Jad says, sparing their lives is a mighty blessing for them. That's the whole point of the jizya. That's a good way to summarize it for Ibn Arabi. And this can be shown in a number of passages which are in that chapter. But there is one chapter that I think has been neglected and not translated, which is chapter 275 of the Futuhat. So we'll look into that in a minute, because I think the predominant view right now is to suggest that the jizya is implemented as a way of humiliating other religious minorities. And I think that does not represent Ibn Arabi's views very well, if at all. I think that would be a serious mistake. So let's look at this passage and see what he says. So then he says, the jizya is not levied upon the mushrik, the associator or the polytheist, for he is distinguished from the unbelievers who belong to the people of the book, the Ahl Kitab, and who have divine revelations. So then he says, the Ahl Kitab malign a certain messenger. In other words, they don't believe in a particular messenger who is Muhammad, due to a whim or a suspicion or a doubt that is established within themselves that led them to deny God or the truth, al-haq, unjustly and condescendingly, even though they have certainty in him. But as for their suspicion, the truthfulness of the one inviting them to Islam, Sahab al-Da'wah, was not proven for them. So it is because of that that overall they do have a correct basis and support, mustanad sahih, as far as they are concerned, but not in the affair itself. So in other words, what they are doing is correct, even though the conclusion they draw about Muhammad is incorrect, about Muhammad not being a prophet. But they are permitted to act in that way. So they are nevertheless protected from being fought against, which is what the jizya is about. When you pay the tax, you enjoy the protection of the Muslim state. So the jizya is levied upon them, and they are left to the religion to establish it, or some of it, according to the measure of success they are given in that. That is the historical purpose of the jizya, arguably. So then Ibn Arabi is going to emphasize a point here. And he says, here is a delicate point for the one of understanding. It is that their religion is lawful for them through our law, so that they are confirmed in it, right? So he's focusing on their inclusion. He's not necessarily, in fact, he's not focusing on the problem of, is the jizya designed to humiliate other religious minorities or not? Because for him, I don't think it really is. The stress is clearly on the subsistence of the religion and their right to adhere to it, not on their subjugation or humiliation. In fact, he does not even mention the requirement to humble them in this particular instance. So then he says, it is because of this that the messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, when he heard that the Byzantines, Rome, prevailed over Persia, his face beamed with joy, even though the Byzantines disbelieved in him. But the messenger, peace and blessings be upon him, due to his knowledge, was fair, because he knew that the support that the Byzantines stood upon was the same foundation as the people of truth or God al-Haqq. They are Ahl al-Haqq. It's the same support that they stand upon. So the support that the Byzantines stand upon, it's the same foundation that the people of God stand upon, since they are Ahl al-Kitab and believe in him. But suspicion overcame them because, according to, this is Ibn Arabi's perspective, their religious leaders, a'immathum, distorted what was revealed to them, and this prevented them from believing in and acknowledging the prophethood of Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, or his universality. So that means the universality of his message and the responsibility of all people to respond to him. Our words are directed at the just and fair-minded one from their scholars. Hence, the law excuses them to this extent of what is known about them, so they have an excuse. God protectively guards them, since they unified him and did not associate with him, whereas Persia and the idol worshippers did. So they're distinguished from the idol worshippers. And then a more contemporary scholar from the 20th century, Baha'u'ddin Baitar, who specializes in Ibn Arabi's works, says this: whoever obeys the messenger, that is Muhammad, has thus obeyed God. That's one of the verses in the Quran. And Muhammad is a mercy for all the worlds, according to the Quran. Hence, all the worlds are included within Muhammad. So the protected minorities, Ahl al-Dhimma, are included in us as a community, or in Muhammad, just as all the worlds are included in him. Him having this trans-cosmic reality as the Muhammadan reality. So long as they give the tax, indemnity by hand humbled, according to the quotation in the Quran. So he confirmed for the Christians, in this instance he's talking about Christianity, he confirmed for the Christians what they were upon. For their gospel is included, mundaraj, right? We come back to the same word that's in the solar metaphor. Indarajat, al-nujum fi shams, okay? Indarajat. So here, this is mundaraj. Their gospel is included in the Quran. Since if Islam includes all the previous laws, then by extension, it's also believed that the Quran is an all-encompassing book that includes all the other religious books. So the gospel is included in the Quran. So God says, let the people of the gospel judge by what God has revealed in it. So if they judge by the gospel, they are not judging except by God's judgment, which he sent down upon Muhammad. From this perspective, they are laboring under Muhammad's ruling. And maybe this isn't a great word, laboring, because the word is amal, ya'malun, which means they earn good deeds. That's the word al-amal. They're acquiring their obedience from God under Muhammad's ruling by abiding by his command. So they are within Muhammad's ruling and Sharia. So there's a repetition of the word mundaraj, and it comes up more than once, actually. So the previous laws are included under Muhammad's universally abrogating and all-encompassing law. So in what manner are those laws brought to life, if you like? Through the payment of the jizya is one way, but there's another way as well. And we get into the wider question of his metaphysics, which is that one can worship God through multiple laws simultaneously, which sounds a bit weird, but I'll explain that in a minute. So Ibn Arabi says, by extension, the perfect man, the perfect human being, thus worships God through every sharia, through every law. So Muhammad's law encompasses all the previous laws in the same way that his sharia encompasses all the madhab, right? So it includes all 124,000 prophetic laws according to Islamic tradition. And it also, by extension, includes the laws created by the sages, the previous ages, not just prophets. So what that means is there are scholars in China, historically, who I think have understood this principle, and applied it. And this includes Chinese Muslims like Lu Qi and Wang Dayu. And so Lu Qi considers himself to be a follower of Confucius and Muhammad. So how can you be a follower of Confucius and Muhammad at the same time? It's a bit strange, but he considers Confucius to be, or Muhammad to be in the same line of stages as Confucius. So then he combines Confucianism with Islam. And that's not necessarily impossible to do, even if maybe Islam needs to take precedence over Confucianism, but they can still be combined together, right? The previous laws are not simply tossed out. So let's go to the next slide. This is spelled out in chapter 36 of the Futuhat, right? And another example is given through Christianity, right? So Ibn ʿArabī talks about a Christian saint who is given this strange charisma of super longevity. He's lived for hundreds of years, right? Until Muhammad's law came. And so he lived to see both laws. So he follows the law of Christ and the law of Muhammad at the same time when Muhammad's law descended. And so he believes in both laws. So what Ibn ʿArabī explains in this chapter is that someone like this Christian saint, his name is Ibn Bartholomew, which translates to the son of Bartholomew, worships God in two laws. So he has two tastings, two spiritual adwaq, the tasting of Christ and the tasting of Muhammad. So he tastes the spiritual realities of Christ and he tastes the spiritual realities of Muhammad. So how does this abrogation work in this context, right? Well, Jesus' law, as we see in the previous slide, becomes absorbed into Muhammad's law. But so do the rulings in Jesus' law. They become absorbed into Muhammad's law. So the ahkam in Christ's law become enfolded. So the word he uses is enfolded into Muhammad's law. So it's antawa. It's very similar to indaraja. They become enfolded into Muhammad's law. So what is an example of one of the rulings of Jesus' law? Well, it's permissible for Christians, according to Ibn ʿArabī, to worship God with the aid of forms and images and statues and icons, which is a very interesting perspective. And Ibn ʿArabī says that the reason for that is because the usage of icons in Christianity is rooted in the very foundation of the law through Gabriel in the Annunciation when it comes to Mary. So the verse in the Quran says, so when Gabriel comes, فَهُوَ فَتَمَثَّلَ لَهَا بَشَرًا سَوِيًّا فَتَمَثَّلَ لَهَا. So normally in normal translations it says he appears to her in the form of a woe-shaped man, right? But that's not the actual word in the Quran. فَتَمَثَّلَ لَهَا is he turns himself into a physical representation to Mary in the shape of a well-formed man. So I think this is a validation of the Orthodox tradition, because you might gloss the verse as he iconized himself to Mary, because فَتَمَثَّلَ لَهَا, تَمَثَّلَ has the same word and meaning of statue, timthal, and representation, mathala, muthala as well. He iconized himself to Mary. So he says that's permissible to the Christians in their community. But then when Muhammad's all embracing and abrogating law comes, it absorbs and unfolds Christ's law and its rulings into his own law, which undergoes a metamorphosis, masakh, so that it becomes ratified in a way that is specific to the Muhammadan law. So then Muhammad says, "A'bud Allah ka'annaka tarahu." Worship God as though you see him, right? Worship God as though you see him. And so this as if you see him, and please keep bringing on the questions. I just want to get through a few slides before I can answer them, but yeah, please keep writing them. A'bud Allah ka'annaka tarahu. Worship God as if you see him. So the ka'annaka, the kaf there is kaf tashbih. So for Ibn ʿArabī understands that to mean worship God as if you see him. It means bring an image of God into your mind. So you're therefore permitted to worship God in images, but through the use of your imagination, through the aid of your imagination, right? He says the root of that is Christ's law, which is enfolded now in Muhammad's law. And that is an example of metamorphosis. And a similar example can be given through Solomon's law, but I won't get into that right now. So this raises the question, can there be multiple sharia? Just like in the previous chapter, we say yes and no. the meaning of no is technically there's only one Sharia remaining today, but it does not mean that it's a monolithic Sharia. It just means that the previous authority of the previous laws are abrogated. Their independence is abrogated. Yes means they do continue to exist, but the other Sharia, the other laws can continue to exist within Muhammad's Sharia. They continue to exist through Sharia. That is, probably speaking, Akbarian abrogation. And that leads us to the question of a superlative mercy, because it is a question, it is a fact for Ibn Arabi that the reason these rulings and were made is to have mercy on people. And here Rahmah translates into loving mercy as well, not just mercy. So it's another example where he talks about the jizya, chapter 520. And Ibn Arabi mentions that God refuses to exclude anyone from his rahmah. And Ibn Arabi says, praise be to God, that I am not one of those who love retribution and vengeance. It really it's the driving force in the futuhat. And it's also an allusion to his function as what he perceives to be the complete inheritor of Muhammad, the seal of Muhammadan sainthood, who was sent as a mercy to all the worlds. So in reference to that verse, Ibn Arabi says, God did not specify the believers over others with regards to Muhammad's mercy, right? Because he was given, he was sent as a mercy to everyone, not just Muslims. And so this is realized and actualized in levying the jizya upon the Ahl Kitab, right? Because sparing people's lives is a mighty mercy. And allowing them to practice their religion is a mercy. And looking towards their salvation is a mercy. The only reason for the descent of this verse is because of the divine imprecation, dua bil mu'akhadha al-ilahiyya, which Muhammad wanted to make against a group of Arab tribes who betrayed his people and massacred them. So then God forbade him from making that imprecation against them and sent this verse down instead. So if the messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, was told off, censured for exercising his right over the polytheist associator, of whom it was reported that God will not forgive him in the Quran, then how is the affair with those who are not associators, even if they do not believe in Muhammad's prophethood? They definitely are encompassed within that mercy as well. But as we'll come to see, it's not just the Jews and Christians and Ahl Kitab or monotheists. And there's many other examples I talked about, but I don't have time to get into them, but they're in the book, from the Fusus al-Hikam and the Futuhat. Like Fasl Isa has a major passage, but it's in the book, right? Just to summarize the conclusions, this is what abrogation means to Ibn Arabi. It's a two-part process, annihilation and subsistence. They're annihilated from their independence, and they subsist through Muhammad's law. That combines the inclusivist and exclusivist views. And scholars tend to focus on one or the other, which is why you end up with a skewed perspective. Now, the jizya is simply one method of inclusion. I'm convinced that there are other methods. It's not just the jizya. And it's a mistake to say that the jizya is the only method. But I've talked about it extensively because it is an important mechanism nevertheless. And the chapter also discusses the problem of humiliation, but I've skimmed over it. But it is discussed in the chapter, right? Ibn Arabi uses the jizya to include people, even enemies, included in conflict and warfare, include them into the ummah. So what are those who aren't even enemies? And this is an example of what I call Ibn Arabi's doctrine of excuses. He tries to find excuses to save people. And that leads us to the third chapter, which assesses the model of Gregory Lipton against my own model. So I just want to skim this. And we won't get into too much detail, but I think what's happening here is that Gregory Lipton tries to take on a lot. And it is a book I do need to analyze because it's a very important contribution to the literature we have thus far. So he tries to get into a lot of fields, and I think this is maybe where he somewhat falls down, even though the book is a brilliant book. But I think he tries to cover a very wide range of disciplines in a very small book, not just Ibn Arabi, not just his views on religious pluralism, but modern theories like critical theory, decolonial theory, perennialism, Immanuel Kant, intellectual history, and so on and so forth. So it's a really good example of interdisciplinary studies. But his analysis of Ibn Arabi might be somewhat short-sighted, myopic. So I think this might raise a question about a problem of how his academic theories drive the analysis more than the texts in Ibn Arabi's writings itself, which is the problem. There's a question about Gregory Lipton's methodology. Why is it that out of tens of thousands of passages in the Futuhat and other passages in Ibn Arabi's writings, Lipton considers only a very small selection? I mean, it is a rather minuscule selection, with many other passages neglected. I mean, there's maybe like a handful of key passages he looks at, but it's clear that I don't think he's even gone through the first, what's called the first fasl of the Futuhat. There's 6 fusul, there's 6 sections. I would expect one to at least have gone through the first section, which would have changed a lot of his views. So for me, it's ultimately a cautionary tale about the way we approach interdisciplinary studies. But notwithstanding that, it's still a brilliant book. Now, he works with certain key assumptions, but using critical theory and so on and so forth, he says that the discourse of religion means that really people don't just write about airy-fairy mystical realities. There's an implicit assumption of power embedded in those discussions. So if we look at the time period Ibn Arabi lived in, the assumption would have been that he would have been a religious absolutist. So he would be engaged in a discourse of religious absolutism, embedded in a historical locality. And so even if Ibn Arabi has claims to universalism, Gregory Lipton says that all modalities of universalism are instantiations of power. So for him, any passage in which Ibn Arabi talks about universalism is an expression of hegemony, hegemonic power, of hierarchy in which Muslims rule over non-Muslims and are overlords over them. And so he utilizes a grammar of universal monarchy in which there are moments of political exclusion. Now, I disagree with a lot of these assumptions. So he has key arguments, but I'm not going to get into all of them. There's maybe like a couple we'll look at. But briefly, his argument is that there are hegemonic power structures which are expressed through a cosmopolitical model of subsumption and humiliation by subjugating other religions to Muhammad's monarchical religion. And that there's no way for other religions to gain salvation or practice the religion except by paying the jizya in a state of humiliation. And that Ibn Arabi's well-known passages on religious universality are not concerned with universality belief, but rather with solidifying power structures. And that Ibn Arabi's discussion of beliefs is not concerned with non-Islamic religions. He's talking about an intra-religious dialogue with other schools of theology and creed, like the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ira, the Mu'tazilites and the Ash'arites. Right, so let's just get into some of these. And the second argument, he is saying that the jizya is the only way to gain salvation or be accepted into the fold of Islam. That's completely wrong. Because why does Ibn Arabi have this passage then in the Kitab al-Tajaliyat when he says, how many walk upon the earth whilst the earth curses him? How many prostrate themselves upon her, the earth, but she does not accept it? How many preachers whose words do not go beyond their lips or thoughts beyond their minds? And how many a beloved saint, Wali Habib, is to be found in synagogues and churches? That means Bira and Kanisa, Kana'is. How many a hated enemies to be found in prayer rooms and mosques? Who does this for the sake of that and is only reckoning what he will get himself out of it, right? So Ibn Arabi is now admitting that there is walaya, sainthood, in other religions, not just in Islam, and they're beloved to God, right? So I think this passage implies the question of something called tawalli and tawliya, which translates into concepts of sainthood, right? Tawalli is when God takes charge of you because he loves you. This is a form of walaya. And tawliya is when God appoints you to undertake his affairs in creation. This is at least an example of tawalli, when God loves them. And then Osman Yahya just has a comment when he says, how many of this, how many of that. The word in Arabic is kam mashi al ard, kam. So there's two possibilities, linguistically speaking. This can be kam istifham or kam khabar. And it's definitely more of a, because you could be saying, you could be asking the question, how many walk upon the earth, as an actual question, or it's just an expression, how many walk upon the earth, to denote a great multitude and quantity. It's definitely the meaning which denotes a great multitude of quantity. And so Gregory Lipton makes an assumption at the beginning of his book when he says that there are untold numbers of people of the people of the book who are suffering purgatory for the corruption of the scriptures, but he doesn't justify it. There is no source he uses to back it up. So how can one make this argument when there are actually untold numbers, large numbers of Jewish and Christian saints? Second example, in the Kitab al-Tarajim, he says, know that the companion of the book, like the Jew or Christian, if he fulfills the command of his book, that which was revealed prior to its abrogation by our law, and he renounces the world, just as the folk of our path have described it. In other words, he practices asceticism, like the Sufis do. Then he too attains these way stations, munazalat, and spiritual influxes as God wishes. So they are capable of attaining to spiritual heights and gifts. And I think, like we were discussing earlier, because Ibn Arabi uses the expression companion of the book, could this be applicable to Hindus as well, who have these books like the Vedas and the Upanishads? Maybe. It's not guaranteed, but it seems possible to me. And then in chapter 88 of Al-Futuhat, he talks about how he was the companion of a philosopher who practiced spiritual purification, and he benefited from the spiritual purification and was able to be cleansed through the purifying powers of the spirit that came upon him, right? Just by practicing ascetic practices. That's another example. And then chapter 304, this is a very interesting passage. It's long, so we won't go into it. If you want to read it, we can read it at the end of the presentation, where it says effectively, anyone from any sect, any creed, whatsoever, like without exception, whatever his sect or creed, who embodies the quality of poverty and lowliness and brokenness. Some of these virtues are, of course, the most prized possessions and values of the Sufi, right? Having a broken heart. Whoever attains this to the station of servanthood or ubudiyya will eventually, without a shadow of a doubt, be saved. There's no so it is absolute, and we can return to that when if people want to see the actual passage. Of course, it's in the book as well. Now with regard to the third argument, Gregory Lipton says that these certain passages, like this one, beware of delimiting yourself by a specific belief, aqid, and disbelieving in all else. For much good will pass you by. In fact, the knowledge of the affair itself will pass you by. If you reject other people's beliefs, so be in yourself like a hayula, the primordial matter of all forms of beliefs, that since God, the Most High, is too wide and great to be restricted to one belief over another, right? This is an example that's used to illustrate the universality of beliefs in Shaykh al-Akbar's teachings. Gregory Lipton says that this is what Ibn Arabi really means is that it's an example of hegemony. He's only saying that because he wants to possess all beliefs, right? As an example of an instantiation of power. But I think that's completely incorrect. This is demonstrably false. These passages are actually about suluk, which is called spiritual wayfaring, because they have consequences on the Day of Judgment and even in paradise when people go there. And it's also concerned with the problem of anathematization, as we'll see in a minute. So in this passage, Gregory Lipton's argument is not contextualized. What happens in the preceding passage? Ibn Arabi is talking about having bad manners by not perceiving God's presence in other beliefs. What happens to the subsequent passage when he says, lest you miss a great good? What is a great good you'll miss? It's in the hereafter, as we'll see in a second. So this is really about giving good counsel, nasiha, with regard to one's suluk, spiritual wayfaring. So he says this in the Kitab al-Tajaliyat as well. So the one who has no knowledge of the levels of disclosures or homesteads denies it. So I warn you, or be warned of the humiliation, fadiha, when the transformation in the forms of beliefs occurs and you return confirming with newly realized knowledge what you were dismissing by first denying him. What is he talking about? This is a reference to something called hadith al-tahawwul, which he mentions numerous times. And the summary of that hadith, in a nutshell, is that on the day of judgment, so this is mentioned in Bukhari and Muslim, so it's a canonical hadith. It's not like a weird hadith, it's canonical. God comes to people on the day of judgment and transforms himself into other forms of belief. And then people who don't believe in these other beliefs, when they see God, they deny him. So William Shea gave the example that he might come to Baptists in the form of Buddha, and they'll say, you're not God. He might go to Buddhists in the form of Jesus Christ, and they'll say, you're not God. So then he asks them, is there a mark between you and him by which you recognize God? And they'll say, yes, of course. So he transforms them into what they expect God to be, and then they acknowledge him. But then he reverts back to the first form in order to show that the being who was the second form is also the same being of the first form that was denied, right? And there's many examples of that throughout his writings. So this is concerned with ultimately the beatific vision. This is Sheikh's translation, so it's a well-known passage when Ibn Arabi says, the men, the real stalwarts amongst the saints, are those who concur with the belief of every believer in respect of that which has conveyed it to him, taught it, and established it. So on the day of visitation, the day of resurrection, the men will see their Lord with the eye of every belief. So he who counsels his own soul should investigate during his life in this world all doctrines, maqala, concerning God. He should learn from whence each possessor of a doctrine affirms the validity of his doctrine. Once its validity has been affirmed for him in the specific mode in which it is correct for him who holds it, then he should support it in the case of him who believes in it. He should not deny it or reject it, for he will gather its fruit on the day of visitation, whatever that belief might be. So turn your attention to what we have mentioned and put it into practice. So if it's not about saluk, why would he ask you to put it into practice? This is a passage that concerns this very fruit, which is the beatific vision in paradise. So he says, when the people have alighted upon the dune of visions, there's a dune where you sit on it, and then the beatific vision happens. And the real exalted has disclosed himself in all-encompassing self-disclosure in the forms of beliefs, surah al-i'tiqadat. In that one single self-disclosure, when they see him, all of them down to the last person becomes dyed by the light of that self-disclosure. And each one appears with the light of that form he witnessed. So he who knows God in every belief, then he has the light of each belief. And he who knew God in one specific belief, he will not possess anything except the light of that particular belief. And there's more to that passage, which is in the book as well. Ibn Arabi says the same thing in Kitab al-Ajwiba. And then he also says in the Futuhat, the science of sects and creeds is a science that is incumbent upon what are called the folk of Allah, the highest saints, to know the doctrine of every sect and creed, so that they do not stand in the place of denial on the day of judgment. So that's very important. And with regard to anathematizing other people, this is another reason why Ibn Arabi is concerned to talk about beliefs, because he says it's ignorance to blame someone for having a different belief. This is a passage that's well known. We can come back to it in the end. But there's another passage that is not as well known in the Futuhat, and he says, how many people do not believe in the Lord of another believer, seeing that what that other believer attributes to his Lord is an impossible attribute for the former believer's Lord, and so declares him to be an unbeliever because of it. If he had not glorified or purified God completely, sabbahahu mutlaqan, so it means both to glorify and to purify, i.e. without restriction. So if he had glorified and purified him completely with the belief of every believer, this individual would glorify the other Lord whom he does not believe to be purified, right? Right? You would not anathematize him. And the fourth argument will be seen in the fourth chapter of the book, but essentially he's saying this is an intra-religious discussion. So Ibn Arabi is not talking about other religions. Ibn Arabi will not talk about this concept of beliefs, al-i'tiqadat, with regard to non-Muslim religious communities in his exposition of this metaphysical idea. But that's just completely false, because in chapters 69 and 72 of the Futuhat, The Sheikh will describe his meeting with a group of pagan sun worshippers he met in Anatolia. And there's a number of themes he discusses in those passages, but foremost amongst them is the question of belief and i'tiqadat. Foremost amongst them is the metaphysical question of how does God manifest himself in the form of other people's beliefs, right? So, in conclusion, the assumptions built into Lupton's model, I think, are not tenable when it comes to Ibn Arabi. And there's more to be said, but it's in the chapter. I think there's key passages missing from his analysis that renders the conclusions problematic. You cannot use humiliation as a way to frame Ibn Arabi's pluralism. That is deeply flawed. The jizya is of course not the only way to frame Ibn Arabi's pluralism. We cannot do that. The law and mercy is a much better way to measure and approach Ibn Arabi, right? And this will become clear with regards to the non-Abrahamic religions in chapter 4. So he uses a number of tools and mechanisms with which to include non-Abrahamic religions, and this is it. We will not go into all of them. We'll go into some of them, but very briefly, he already talks about this in the Fusus al-Hikam, in Fasl Yaqub, when he says, the religion is two, the religion that is with God and the religion that is made by man. So with regard to the religion that is made and invented by men, God accepts it when it aligns with the goals that are established in the religion that is revealed by God. And these are called the Nawamis al-Hikmiyya, the laws that are brought by the sages, not the prophets. And this is alluded to in Surah Hadid, which is the verse on monasticism, Rahbaniyya, وَرَهْبَانِيَّةً ابْتَدِعُوهَا. But in the Sheikh's technical vocabulary, it does not necessarily mean monasticism, even though that's the correct translation. But if you say, وَرَهْبَانِيَّةً ابْتَدِعُوهَا, it now means sagehood, the sagehood that was invented by the sages. So, these laws or paths were invented by sages who wanted to seek God's good pleasure. So God confirms them in it. But then he says, these are the laws of the sages, which were not brought by no messenger from God for the people. He placed into their hearts the narration, ta'atim, of what they themselves have prescribed, seeking God's pleasure in that way. And that is what they believed. So this is an explicit example of where there's an intertwine between laws and beliefs. The law confirms their belief in specific circumstances. The most obvious example is when a prophet is absent, but it is by no means the only way in which it is done. Now, I'll give you a brief summary of this metaphysical concept, which is al-i'tiqadat, right? Which means beliefs, but the root word means to knot or tie something. So it is when you tie a belief or a knot into your heart, and it kind of like delimits the way you perceive reality. It sets the boundaries for what you accept about God and what you don't accept about God, according to your belief. So this governs an important precept in Ibn Arabi's teachings when he says, God manifests himself to you in the form of your belief. وَاللَّهُ يَظْهَرْ لَكَ فِي سُورَةِ اعْتِقَادِكَ, right? He manifests himself to you in the form of your belief. And it's rooted in a lot of basic scriptural data, like wherever you turn, there's the face of God. أَيْنَمَا تَوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ. So therefore, Ibn Arabi's metaphysics requires that we perceive God in all beliefs, lest we stand in the place of denial on the day of judgment. Therefore, you cannot deny that there is a presence, a divine presence in all beliefs. And you're required to know them if you want to know God more. To the extent that you are ignorant of them, then you're simultaneously ignorant of God. So he spells this out in various places, but especially in chapter 69 and 72 of the Futuhat, when he meets the sun worshippers, and he calls them Shamsiyya. He says that he meets them in Anatolia, which would be modern-day Turkey, but he doesn't say where exactly he meets them, but he was invited to have lunch with one of their scholars. And so he asks them, while he's sitting at his banquet table, why are you associating the sun in your worship of God? So why are you doing shirk? So the Greek scholar, I think, would have been familiar with a basic level of Islamic teachings by his time. So he responds rather immediately, God forbid, hashallah, we do not worship the sun in as much as the sun. God is one God. But our learned scholars simply investigate what benefits this most tremendous light, An-Nur al-Azim, has in the cosmos. So then he enumerated the benefits God connected to it. So from those benefits, we knew that if it did not have solicitude from God, he would not have entrusted it to these matters. Hence, we seek nearness to it through veneration, ta'zim, which is a word we came across in Faris Yaqub as well, that we may have a most beautiful intermediary with God for our deliverance, or for our purification. For us, the Son is a poor slave of God Almighty. Indeed, it is through God that he, quote unquote, he, i.e. the Son, is granted solicitude. This is what he said to me whilst we were sitting at his table eating from his banquet. And so Ibn ʿArabī entitles this passage, this is the prostration of ijtihad and exerting oneself to the utmost, badal mashhud, because of what behooves God's majesty in glorifying and taking pleasure in him. So what are the takeaway points from this passage? Ijtihad is, so that was a prostration of ijtihad. The scholar was using his ijtihad to find out what was going to please God, right? So the ijtihad is a legal mechanism that sanctions the worship of a non-Islamic group or religion. And veneration, ta'zim, as a form of worship is permitted and explored in other areas of Ibn Arabi's writings, like in the Fusus al-Hikam. The second passage, with regard to the sun worshippers, I won't get into the context, we'll just briefly go through the passage. So he says, they only worship the sun because they imagine it is a god. So they only prostrate to God, not to the sun itself, right? Because in Ibn Arabi's metaphysics, there's only one wujud, there's only one being. So whatever you worship, no matter what that object of worship is, it is always God, whether you know it or not. So rather, they are bowing down to their own judgment, that it is God. I was a guest of one of their scholars, and I learned from him about their worship of the sun and prostration to it. He said to me, there is nothing but God. So the sun is the closest relation we have to God in terms of what God has placed in it of light and benefits. Therefore, we exalt it just as God exalts it by what he has placed in it. So God knows that they only worship him even if they err in the ascription. The believer worships only God and thus resembles the unbeliever in his belief in God. Therefore, the business is like the divine law, which abrogates parts of itself. So we come back to abrogation. Here, this belief has no effect on belief, and it is not stronger than it, since the matter is as we mentioned. In respect of his belief in the God, min i'tiqadi al-ilah, he has the right to do so, or as a possessor of truth. But in respect of ascribing divinity to the Son, he is an unbeliever or one who covers up God. So he's looking at the etymology of the word kafir, which means to cover up. So then Ibn Arabi says, so the real observes the meaning which they intended. He is concerned with what they intended. So it is from here that they are confirmed in and singled out for prostration to the sun during its times of sunrise and sunset, but not the Muslim believers. So the abrogation of the prostration of the believers in that time thus belongs to God. It is the effect of belief, unbelief, iman fi iman, not the effect of disbelief, unbelief. So then the takeaway point here is abrogation of the divine revealed laws is used again, but explicitly drawn up here analogously to include the sun worshippers, not exclude them. That's a very important point. So that's a form of inclusion. And laws and beliefs are intertwined. God manifested himself to them in the form of their beliefs, through which he was worshipped, and their worship became sanctioned through law. And beliefs also thus shape law, and law in turn shapes beliefs. It is erroneous to treat them in complete isolation from one another. And it's also one of the earliest recorded proto-interfaith Islamic dialogues with a non-Abrahamic religion, which I think is incredibly fascinating. So how can Ibn Arabi say this? It's very simple, because with regard to ijtihad, Ibn Arabi says that our position is that ijtihad is permitted in the principles and the corollaries of legal rulings, no difference. Normally, ijtihad is not permitted in the usul, but Ibn Arabi is quite different. So when that pagan, sun-worshipping Greek scholar is doing ijtihad in the usul, he says that's permitted. Why is this? Because it is rooted in a hadith which does not differentiate between them. And the hadith says that the person who's doing ijtihad in a mas'ala, if he gets it right, he gets 2 rewards. But if he gets it wrong, he still gets 1 reward. And the hadith does not differentiate between the foundations of the religion or its legal applications. So for Ibn Arabi, people are permitted to practice ijtihad in the usul and the furu'a. And then there's also a legal twist, or a Sufi twist, in which the mujtahid is also a salik, a wayfarer. And there's many other supporting passages, so I'll just go through them very briefly. When Ibn ʿArabī meets Idris in the fourth heaven, Idris, or Ibn ʿArabī tells Idris, who was Enoch, then I said, O founder of the arts and sciences of wisdom, ijtihad in the branches is lawful according to us. And I'm speaking for the ulama of the age because this is what they say. So then Idris said, but it's also lawful in the roots too, so that God only burdens the soul with what it can bear. This comes from a Quranic verse. They're permitted to practice usul because that if this is all that they can do. So I said, but because of this, the differences concerning the real God and the doctrines, maqalat of him became many. And he said it could not be otherwise. The affair accords with one's constitutions. That's another example of law intertwining with metaphysics. Now, ordinarily in Islamic law, shirk, the worship of multiple gods, is not forgiven by God, and it's normally punished. But then Ibn ʿArabī specifies, after saying that, but not every associator, not every mushrik. Rather, only the associators who were sent messengers or did not give rational consideration its rightful due and did not strive. For the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, has reported that the striver mujtahid, if he errs, he is rewarded. Did not separate the branch from the root. No, he generalized. In other words, one is permitted to perform ijtihad in any religious matter. And then he verified God's words. My mercy embraces everything in that manner, and my mercy has thus outstripped my wrath. The Emir al-Jazairi echoes the same words. And then one of the most interesting passages in this whole thesis is found in chapter 363 of the Futuhat, and it is a mythopoesis of idolatry. I am sorry if I will not be able to go into it, but it's a very long passage, and if you are able to read it, it is a very interesting passage. The summary of the passage is that we were witnessing God in pre-eternity, but when we came into this world, our vision of him was cut off. So there's a certain group of people who experienced anxiety as a result of that. So when they did that, they tried to take an object of worship, a physical object, whether it's from the higher world or the lower worlds, as an object of worship in order to venerate it and reestablish that divine connection. So then Ibn ʿArabī says, well, guess what? That idolater is a mujtahid. And then he continues his mythopoesis and he says that then they see the prophets performing all these things, what are called manasik, these rituals in which they venerate things, like kissing the God's right hand, which is the black stone, doing this, doing that, doing prostrations, bowing down, this, that. So they intermix the prophets' practices with their own ijtihad and worship of the idols. And so they're doing what? Ta'zim, it's the same word, right? That we saw with regards to the sun worshippers. They are venerating it or worshiping it and associating with God. And then Ibn ʿArabī says, who is doing this? The masters, the first the first rational or investigative thinkers. Does this allude to the pre-Socratic philosophers? I'm not so sure. It's a possibility, and I talk about more in the chapter. So this mujtahid idolater then intermixes his worship of idols with these prophetic practices in order to draw closer to God, right? So then he says, this idolater then learns from the divinely revealed laws that the felicity of the mujtahid is absolute. Whether he hits the mark or errs, he will be rewarded either way. He will be rewarded either way, and he is forgiven either way. And the same applies to his followers, because all the follower has to do is to all the follower has to do is to ask the mujtahid what the right answer is, and then he becomes excused as well. And there's more details to do with this in the chapter as well. So he says, it is along these lines that you will know what is shirk and what is the attributes of the mushrik. God has forgiven them from one perspective. He says to them, do not despair of God's mercy, for God forgives the sins, all of them. This is if the servant intentionally does the sin, believing it is a sin. So what is the state of the one who does not intentionally sin and took that mode of worship as a way of being near to God because of some confusion that became established for him? So he is even more deserving of God's forgiveness. And that leads us back to the issue of diversity of beliefs in God. amongst the masters of the divinely revealed laws and other than them. So he says, so whoever wishes to hit the true target and give God his due, God will grace him with knowledge of his vastness and immensity, and that he is with the belief of every believer, witnessed by them. It is not correct that he is absent from the belief of the believer, for he has not tead, right, like belief, rabata, he has not tead his belief to him, and he is witness over everything. Therefore, the possessor of this knowledge always sees the real, in other words, God, in every form. So he does not deny him when the one who has restricted him denies him. But with all this, God has pardoned whoever binds him by way of incomparability or similarity, tanzih or tashbih, from the leaders of religion. And that finally leads us to the last chapter of the book, which is about no-amis. I don't have time to go into it, so I'll just read one passage, and then we'll try to get to the conclusions. So this is a good summary of this idea. The no-amis are the laws that are invented by men, right? Well, the chapter tries to go into the history a little bit of this word, this terminology, because it's rooted in Farabian political philosophy, and that has implications as well. So here's a passage that summarizes this idea in a nutshell. So these are the laws invented by the sages. So Ibn ʿArabī, what does he say about them? He says, God made these limits and customs of two kinds. One kind is called wise regulation, siyasat al-hikmiyya, right? Which could also be translated into politics. He cast it into the original dispositions of the souls of the great human beings. Hence, they set down limits and established laws through a power that they found in their own souls. They did so in every city, place, and clime, in accordance with what was demanded by the constitution and nature of those areas, since they knew what wisdom demanded. Through that, they preserved the possessions, lives, families, relatives, and kinship relationships of the people. I just want to pause for 1 second. Does this remind people of anything? Possessions, amwal, lives, arwah, families, relatives. Does that remind anyone of anything? If you studied fiqh, usul fiqh, right?
Maqasid?
No. Say it again.
Maqasid?
The maqasid of the Sharia, exactly. Good. So this is another tool that Ibn ʿArabī uses to be inclusive of other non-Abrahamic faiths. He uses the maqasid of the Sharia. Excellent. Yes, exactly. So then he says, they named the laws, nawamis, a word that means cause of good, since namus in technical usage is the one through whom good comes. So these were the wise laws, nawamis al-hikmiyya, established by the rational thinkers as the result of an inspiration from God, of which they were unaware for the sake of the wholesomeness. That means the maslaha and masalih, order and arrangement of everyone in the world where there was no divinely revealed religion. So we're not going to get into this, I apologize, but it's a very fascinating subject, and it does come in great detail in the chapter. So please do check it out if you can. I will go through like one passage, a final passage, and then like we'll just end the presentation for now. So the idea is that there's multiple tools through which he includes the other religions, right? So you've got ijtihad, you've got the nawamis, then you've got the maqasid al-sharia. So I'll use this passage as an example of the maqasid al-sharia. So what does he say? He says that there are two kinds of revelation. A kind that comes with an indication that it is from God, which is the divinely revealed law of the prophets, and another that has no indication. The latter is non-prophetic law, an-namus al-wadi'iyya, necessitated by wisdom and hikmah. God, the Exalted, casts it from his name, al-batin al-hakim, the inward, the wise, into the hearts of the sages of the air, hukama al-waqt, from where they do not perceive it. So they legislated for their followers amongst the people of their era, since there is no prophet amongst them who has established the proof of prophethood, right? But it's, by the way, it's not limited to the pre-prophetic period, but I can explain that later. So if they establish the legal limits, the hudud of that namus, i.e. the penal code, restricting themselves to it and observing it, God recompenses them in accordance with that for how they acted in this world and the next. They are recompensed in accordance with the established law indicated by the words and what they observed of it rightfully, concerning that which they invented of rahbaniyya, sagehood, monasticism. And based on the hadith, Whoever establishes a good and beautiful custom, he shall have his reward, and the reward of whoever else does it. And whoever establishes a bad custom shall bear its sin and the sin of those who do it. So God confirms the doctrine of the one who establishes the law derived from wisdom, just as he confirms the one who brings the revealed law that establishes judgment. Yeah, that's basically it. There's many other examples, but I'm just gonna not go through them. Yeah, so what you end up with is like a stratification of many different degrees of plurality, one after the other, which are from this chapter and the previous chapters, as to how the other religions are included, right? Especially when it talks about every sage from every clime, every place. That could include a multitude of possibilities, whether it's from China, India, or some other country, right? And there's one example after the other, one example after the other, one example after the other, right? In future, so if this is the inclusion of the divinely revealed laws and the inclusion of man-made laws and sagacious laws and sects and creeds, in future, I want to look at the possibility of what happens to the inclusion of divinities. How are they included in Islam, right? Because the different gods are just God's madhar, his loci of manifestation, because there's only one being, right? But that's a different story, and that's from Fas Nuh. So I'll just end with this final quotation when God says, "We never chastise until we send forth a messenger." So why did he reveal this verse, right? If people are unable to perceive what God's message proves, they are excused. So hence, this verse has within it a tremendous mercy because of the diversity of human dispositions that lead to a diversity of what? Views, doctrines, beliefs. So he who knows the all-inclusiveness of the divine mercy, which God reports embraces all things, knows that God did this only because of mercy towards his servants. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Faris, for the nice presentation. So now we'll move to the panelists. Yeah, Dr. Mukhtar Ali, are you here?
He couldn't make it.
Okay, yeah, okay. So Reverend Frank Gelli, yeah.
Thank you for a very clear exposition of the thought of Ibn Arabi. Maybe too clear, I might say, because to me, it raised the question, I mean, how from a Christian point of view, how problematical the ideas of Ibn Arabi are. However, to temper this particular opinion, may I refer to a Christian monk, friend of mine, indeed a spiritual director of mine, and a member, honorary member of the Ibn Arabi Society, Dom Sylvester Woodard, who was a monk at a monastery called Bryn Abbey in Gloucestershire. And I went to see him before I went on a retreat, before I went on as a chaplain to a British embassy Ankara. This is many years ago. And he brought me a copy of a Quran, actually. And he said, "You're going to a Muslim country, read this." But he was very keen on Ibn Arabi. And while I was in Turkey, sometimes we corresponded, sometimes I felt I had a tough time, and he quoted Ibn Arabi to me. And especially a saying of Ibn Arabi he was very fond of was, "He who knows himself knows his Lord." Now,
Yes.
I know there are various renderings from the Arabic of this, but this is not the point. The point is he saw this hadith as unifying this double movement of descent and ascent. And I mean, Sylvester actually gave examples of pre-Islamic thinkers and writers from a Christian point of view who, in a way, anticipated that particular hadith. For example, one was, "We are advancing perpetually towards God only because he advances towards us." And that is a statement by St. Basil of Caesarea, a Cappadocian father. And there are many other examples which he quoted. Now, again, to me, it conveys the idea that you can, even from a Christian point of view, you can have a positive understanding of Ibn Arabi. And I'm very keen on a particular point of view. I should also say that, of course, Ibn Arabi is a very sort of torrential kind of writer. But
Yes.
I recommend one of my favorite books by Ibn Arabi, which is, I don't know, have you got my image here? I can't see my own image. But this, of course, is Sufi Andalusia, which I bought a long time ago. It is published by Beshara. It's a wonderful collection of the lives of Sufi saints, mostly from Al-Andalus, but some from other parts of the Islamic world. And in a way, they tend to be quite concise and very pithy and memorable. And I don't know, not in content, but in form, reminds me of John Aubrey's brief lives. John Aubrey was an English writer who wrote very short thumbnail sketches of eminent and non-eminent people, from Shakespeare, Descartes, and so on. Very memorable. And in form, again, not in content, I think the Sufis Andalusia reminded, and can I quote only one example, which I think I absolutely love it. And it's about someone whose name was Abdullah ibn Jadun al-Hinnawi bin Muhammad bin Zakaria, a Sufi who had asked God to remove his reputation from the eyes of the world.
Yes.
So Ibn Arabi says, when he was absent, he was a mist. When he was present, no one sought his advice, and in conversation, he was passed over and ignored. And then here comes the punchline. Ibn Arabi says, and this man was one of the 4 supporters of Qutb. I don't have to explain to you who Qutb is in Sufism. So it's a wonderful example of self-effacing of a Sufi who was actually profoundly deep and important in the spiritual hierarchy of Sufism. Should also say that there is a little touch of vanity of Ibn Arabi, because he mentioned a painter who had painted a wonderful painting of Partridge, was so very lifelike. And the painter asked him, well, there is a small defect in this painting. Can you detect it? When Ibn Arabi, of course, detected it. It was actually some kind of lacunar portion of one of the legs. So maybe Ibn Arabi is a small sign of his vanity, fancying himself as an art critic. But anyway, I think I've said enough, and I've always been interested in Ibn Arabi. And once again, our speaker conveyed to me the depths of his spiritual ocean. That, and again, I don't want to be hypocritical. There is a problematical element from a Christian point of view.
All right. Faris, do you want to have comments, or should we move on?
I think we can move on. I think I got the gist of the idea. I'm not sure if there's a question, but I did get the gist of the idea, and thank you very much for your commentary. Thank you very much, Frank. It's been a pleasure having you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Okay, so let's move to the next panelist, Dr. Amina Inloes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I genuinely enjoyed that. I'm very critical, but I actually don't have any criticisms. I do think it was well explained, and although Reverend Gelli did bring up that point, for me, I felt it was a very helpfully lucid breakdown of some of Ibn Arabi's ideas, and it will likely be very useful for those people who are trying to navigate their way through the oceans and oceans of his thought. So I am looking forward to the book. I did appreciate that you did emphasize that he doesn't necessarily need to be categorized as an exclusivist or as an inclusivist. These are categories that we ourselves put forward. And rather than trying to put Ibn Arabi in a box, whether that's exclusivist or inclusivist or any other sort of ideological trend. I also appreciated that you just treated him as himself. He is certainly unique and worthy of being treated as himself. And I think that
Yes.
lends a more authentic and human approach to the subject. And I also think with respect to being neither in all circumstances exclusivist nor in all circumstances inclusivist is something many Muslims today can likely also agree with. I think in general, most Muslims don't believe that Islam is, exclusivist. You're a Muslim or you go to hell. But we may have so for those of us who identify as Muslim, we may have a, sort of a spectrum of ideas of what must be followed, say, for salvation or for religion to be Islamo-compatible and whatnot and so forth. With that in mind, pardon, I also appreciated the way that I felt you and perhaps he also were quite honest in grappling with some things that might be theologically challenging, either to Muslims. So, for example, the story of Hazrat Khidr in the Holy Quran. How is it that this man of God can oppose a prophet of God? That's one of those issues that hangs over you. So it might be just things that have sparked theological discussion among Muslims, but also things that maybe mystics might not necessarily reconcile with the exoteric word of the faith. And definitely, within the passages that you were presenting, although they definitely very much did have the hallmark of the Islamic heritage on them, it was obvious that they do share certain trans-religious mystical themes, which people from a broad variety of backgrounds could identify with. They would be meaningful to many people. But on the flip side, sometimes reconciling those two things, whatever we wish to call it, the exoteric and the esoteric, the experiential and the textual and so forth, that can sometimes lead to new questions, some of which I felt were addressed in the passages you brought up. And again, I felt, for lack of a better word, that was keeping it real, and I thought that was good. I also appreciated the discussion of the non-Abrahamic religions, albeit personally, I thought the encounter with the sun worshippers was a little bit conveniently didactic, and at the very least might have been perhaps copy edited afterwards into something that served his purposes, but I wasn't there. I don't know how prominent sun worship was in Al-Andalus. That would be interesting for me to know a bit more about, during his time. But in any case, I felt that was refreshing because I think for much of the 20th century, when it came to discussions of Islam and other faiths, it was usually Islam and Christianity, or maybe Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. But not a lot of scope for much else, despite, as you mentioned, the interaction between Muslims and people of a broad variety of faith traditions. And I don't know, I don't want to categorize everything that we call a world religion as exactly the same. For example, you brought up Confucianism, which, in some ways differs quite structurally from, say, Christianity. But I felt that was a very valuable thing to discuss. And it's also interesting to see how pre-modern Muslims addressed non-Abrahamic religions, and to be reminded that this isn't an issue that we've suddenly come up with in the 21st century, but it's been there, and there have been ways that people have responded to it, while at the same time remaining true to their own faith. So, identifying fully as a believer in their own tradition, representing their own tradition, but nonetheless finding ways to make space for people who are quite different. And of course, the mention of Confucius does bring to mind all of these sayings that were eventually attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him and his family, about seeking knowledge in China, or, knowledge is the lost property of the believer, and so forth. So it was interesting to actually see a little bit of discussion of that in practice. I would say that looking in particular at contemporary Shi'i Islamic law and the system of religious authority known as the Marja'iyya, which is prevalent in our day and age, certainly what you were saying about the mujtahid and being rewarded if he's right or if he's wrong, and the role of the follower rang a lot of bells in that department, because that's what is said about following the religious authority known as the marja. Of course, that's a little bit different from the spiritual context of the Sadiq and Suluk and Sufism. But nonetheless, it was interesting to think about the similarities and differences in that department. And lastly, before I hand over the platform to the next person, I have to say I appreciated your thoughts on the jizya and challenging some of the, if I may, some negativity about the jizya, which tends to circulate in our time. I felt, again, your approach to the jizya, which of course was built upon Ibn Arabi's approach, so not just your personal pet approach, but your reading of him. Again, it seemed like a very authentic way to deal with it, and one I think that is blessedly bereft of some of the modern and postmodern baggage that we do tend, not we, but some people tend to put on these subjects. I think it's very valuable to be able to look at these things as they might have been understood in their own time and from a variety of lenses, including the spiritual lens, which I think is a valuable reading of that, especially because it does synthesize the legalistic letter of the law with what might be the spiritual reality of the law. So thank you again. I really enjoyed your entire presentation, and I'm looking forward to the book.
All
right. Thank you, Dr. Amina. Faris, comments or?
Just thank you so much for the kind words and constructive remarks and comments. Some worshippers in Anatolia, not Andalus, in Anatolia. That's it.
My bad.
But no. I went a bit fast, but thank you so much. Really appreciate the comments. Thank you, Doctor.
All right. Thank you. Next panelist, Dr. Farhana Mayer.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we do.
I just wanted to confirm. Yes, that's wonderful. Yes. So, first of all, Faris, thank you very, very much for that very, very interesting presentation. You actually addressed a couple of questions that I felt when I was looking through your draft, because I have these past few days, that's what I've been doing. I've been immersed in reading it, and actually my response, and it'll only take not more than 10 minutes, if I may, is to your written work rather than to your presentation.
Sure.
But yeah, as I say, you did actually address some of the questions that I had, I thought came up when I was reading your work. But first, the very first thing that I should do is to congratulate you on the work and to thank you for all your enormous effort that has clearly gone in. It's a tremendous achievement. The work is really well structured and your language is accessible. And that's, not an easy thing to accomplish when your subject matter is the Sheikh al-Akbar. So it shows the fine and incisive skill with which you have approached the materials.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for that. What you have done, I felt, is to disclose for us in forensic detail the intricate mechanisms at work in Ibn Arabi's interpretive process. And from within Ibn Arabi's broader metaphysics, you anchored your discussion of Ibn Arabi's religious pluralism in abrogation as a cornerstone of this pluralism. And then you applied the dual lens of annihilation and subsistence, which you have crucially identified as ubiquitous twin aspects in Ibn Arabi's application of naskh, at least in the text that you have read. And the results of this approach and this framework that you have created and put up is frankly superb. It really is marvelous. There's no way that I can even begin to detail all the subtleties of Ibn Arabi that you have unpacked in your work. So I'll just note a few points, and in a way, this might serve as a bit of a summary again in very much more simplified language for the readers, for the listeners. So you showed how religious plurality from the Islamic point of view is a divine program of cumulative revealed laws, culminating in an all-embracing, all-inclusive last law, which effaces the legal prescriptions that came before, but not effacing the religions themselves. And you do this dissecting Ibn Arabi's central sun-star metaphor for abrogation and his conclusion that the other religions are not rendered null or batil by the rising of Islam. You showed us why Ibn Arabi takes religious abrogation to mean that while the religion of Islam eclipses prior religions, they nonetheless continue to exist as valid religions, just like the sunshine casts a veil of light over the other stars when it rises, but they nonetheless continue to exist exactly as they were. And indeed, their light is merged with the sun's light. In other words, the light of the other religions becomes part and parcel of the light of the eclipsing religion. So there was this question in my mind then that, and you brought it up in your talk. If you can worship God in more than one law, is that syncretism in any way? And perhaps that is something you can address later. But the other thing that I really appreciated is how you showed that Ibn Arabi remained committed to the Muhammadan law as the abrogating law, but ultimately included all the laws within that law without effacing their differences and allowing them to be what they are, but within the purview of the main religion. I guess this is where Lipton would like to talk about hegemony and saying basically you're establishing a dominance and then saying, okay, so long as you accept us as the dominant, then within that, if you pay the jizya, you can you can follow your own way. But I really did appreciate how you showed the rahmah in jizya. I mean, that is quite unexpected and it is very Akbarian and very important to know that there is this element of mercy that is functioning there, even though there is, the obvious political kind of connotation that is not so kind. But you go into the details in your written work, and I really like that. You don't hide from the difficult, you tackle it. And Ibn Arabi, and to be able to do that and to show how Ibn Arabi has actually dealt with this is just, hats off to the amount of work you must have done. Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
So throughout the book, you show that Ibn Arabi works through the Muhammadan law to include within its salvific blessings as many types of people as validly possible. And this is what you call the non-reductionist pluralism. And that, again, is a very good thing because Ibn Arabi does not do away with the law and say, everybody's equal. There is a bit of a hierarchy here. And but within that hierarchy, there is a capacity for everyone to be there. You talked about the different types of believers and worship. So Ibn Arabi included not only the people of the book, but as you pointed out, also the sun worshippers, in as much as they seek to worship the one God through the form of the sun. So the common ground here established by Ibn Arabi between Muslims and pagans is the belief in God and the intended worship of God. So the sun worshipper who worships God through the sun is not a disbeliever, as you pointed out. Even more, Ibn Arabi allows the worship of idols, and this is really quite shocking. It feels incredibly uncomfortable to even say that. But it's so long as it is not the idol form that is worshipped, but something of the true God that the worshippers perceive through the forms. In other words, no matter how God is perceived or in what form he's worshipped, ultimately the main thing is that there be a sincere seeking to know and worship the true God, not of the form. If the form is worshipped, that is shirk. And it's not a kind of carte blanche for everything. So Ibn Arabi does not compromise on the singularity and unity of God. He just shows how infinitely nuanced and capacious that unity is. And this, as you pointed out, the way he discusses the sun idol worshippers fits in with his emphasis on the understanding Surah 17, verse 23, which states that your Lord has ordained that they worship none but him, as meaning that God is always the only one who is worshipped. It's a statement. It's not so much a command, as it were. It's actually a statement of fact from the way Ibn Arabi reads it, that there is no other, la ma'bud illallah, as Abdul Razak al-Kashani puts it, who was one of his commentators. There is none that is worshipped but him. So the religions may be different, like the stars are many, but the God is one and the same always in the multitude of forms that he may allow his creatures to use to know him. So in conclusion, I wanted to put, I mean, as I said, I'm only looking at a few small aspects of your opus here, but your conclusion about Ibn Arabi's merciful inclusivity, you sort of stated that this lies in his refusal to ever deny someone their particular belief in God. A perfect Gnostic, you say, will never deny the belief of another believer, no matter what his sect or creed. So I would add that perhaps if the religious law is a form of knowing God, then it too must be governed by this principle, that it is God who must be sought through the law, and the law must not usurp the place of God. I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that this would be a valid effect of what Ibn Arabi has said. You noted, in fact, that Ibn Arabi himself held that the utility of the Sharia is cosmically limited. It is cut off from the next world, unlike Gnostic knowledge. And you pointed out that Ibn Arabi emphasizes both the significance but also the limitations of the Sharia's obligations. So for Ibn Arabi, the goal of the Sharia is to establish a balance in the cosmos, which he also identified as a goal of the non-prophetic laws. Great common ground here with secular laws and Sharia. And the other goal of the Sharia is to facilitate the servant's felicity in the hereafter, but no more. An expansion of legal rulings makes the human burden heavier, which is counterproductive, as you said. So the overall impression of Ibn Arabi's approach is that the law, like God's own infinite and all-encompassing compassion, the law has to be merciful and elastic, without being diluted or becoming insincere, in order to ensure the salvation of as many as possible who have a genuine turning to and seeking of the truly divine. And part of the elasticity of the law lies in what it does not restrict, or as you put it so well, the law's silence is precisely its plenitude. Emerging from the minutely nuanced discussions of law and beliefs, abrogation, subsistence, you then went into a clear elucidation of the Sheikh's view of the divine attributes and showed how he applies the lens of tanzih, incomparability, and tashbih, comparability, disclosing the divine transcendence and the immanence, and above all, the divine unity catering for all the different kinds of believers. And in addition to highlighting the huge importance of the transparency of form, your presentation of the Sheikh's interpretation of the Islamic proscription of physical forms, but the desirability of imagined forms of God, through reference to the Quran and Hadith, makes this incredibly tricky topic remarkably transparent. It really was, something that is, I think, I do hope everybody reads it, because it is really, really refreshing and interesting to see that. In fact, it's a great example of something which I've heard Toby Mayer talk about, which is that Ibn Arabi's very literalism in interpreting Quranic verses means that he de-restricts their application. A counterintuitive effect of literalism that means that the Quran is not restricted to only one interpretation. And finally, the structure of your book was beautiful. It really builds up to a single soul peak that is at the same time infinitely broad, where the all-encompassing mercy of God and his inclusive care for all his creatures is seen in sharp relief, and the divine presence is found penetrating everywhere. It is the human receptivity, after all, that is variable and which can be obscured through human error. But from that height to which the Sheikh's works lead, as you have shown, Faris, and looking back down the mountain with its diversity of life and sacred forms, and looking all around, the truth of the tajalliyat found in Quran 2, Surah 2, verse 115, which is beloved to the Akbarians and all mystics, is clearly visible, that wheresoever you turn, there is the face of God. So Faris, I thank you wholeheartedly for a beautiful and highly readable exposition of the complexities and the profundities and the heights of the Sheikh's perspectives on these incredibly important matters. Your work is a most welcome addition to this field, and it contributes enormously to it. There are questions, there are difficulties. Ibn Arabi is not an easy read or easy write, but what you have done is you have somehow simplified matters because of the hard work you've put into looking at all the different related material and then drawing the conclusions from that. And this is so special. So barakallah feek, thank you very much. And I hope everyone reads the work. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Farhana. Yes, I had a Faris, I had a request if you could stop sharing your screen. They wanted to see the faces of the respondents. Yeah. So do you have any comments, Faris, or questions? Or
Should I just do this?
yeah, if you
Does
just
that work?
sharing your screen,
And
with
then-
just wanted to see your exactly there. Okay, that's good.
Apologies for that. And thank you, Professor, so much for that wonderful and kind summary of my work and the fact that you took the time to read it. Very much appreciates it. Really, I do owe some debt of gratitude, if not a great deal, to my supervisor, Sajjad Rizvi, who guided me along the way. It's a credit to him as much as to me. So I just wanted to point that out, and thank you so much again. Thank you.
Okay, so if you don't have other comments, I will move to the next panelist, Dr. Dunja Rašić.
Being in an unfavorable position to speak second last after so much has already been said, I will keep my speech and comments short. First, I would like to thank you for the beautiful lecture and even more beautiful and more valuable contribution to Aquarian studies. I have spent the last few days studying the material you sent us, and it was fascinating to me the accuracy of your description of the state of the field of Aquarian studies. How you said that so many things that were taken for granted in the academia 10 years ago, 20 years ago, are now being challenged. Ibn Arabi is immensely popular thinker, and there are so many contributions to the field. There are so many things we know about Ibn Arabi, but still there are even more things that we think we know about Ibn Arabi. And you have beautifully identified the problem of religious pluralism if Ibn Arabi's works, which is often oversimplified or simply misunderstood. I'm really looking forward to reading your book. I liked what I read. Too many studies, even most recent studies, are very limited in scope. They're built usually on Fusus al-Hikam or several chapters of Futuhat al-Makkiyah at best. I appreciate your work because it is much broader in scope. It is wrote in approachable style, and it is very, very well structured, and it's approachable. I appreciate your methodology as well, especially when contrasting it to Lipton. I liked your criticism and critical readings of Lipton's theories. I like the approach that is based on close readings of primary sources, not sometimes on contemporary theories. For example, a good example would be Tomoko Masuzawa's theory, implying that religious pluralism or unity of religions is not an approach fitting of religious studies. It's a theory worth being considered, but the question always remained whether it's applicable to Ibn Arabi's teachings. And I loved your approach because it's not based on assumptions. It's based on direct close readings on primary sources. The part I liked the most and enjoyed reading the most from your work are writings on jizya. And this is not a criticism, just a question I was hoping we could maybe discuss later. I liked how you discussed jizya that shouldn't really be read as a form of subjugation. Did you maybe encounter paragraphs of jizya being discussed with regard to religions and communities of other beings, such as minerals, plants, animals, and angels? You suggested we could maybe discuss that in the questions and answer sessions, which I would like the most. And since you focused on Lipton's approach to the problem, I have one more question. You compared Islam and other religions to sun and the stars. Lipton tried to resolve the problem of the stars, man-made stars, or the question, why did God allow for humans to corrupt the teachings of the prophets, and Ibn Arabi's view on the matter? Lipton analyzes the problem with regard to Judaism and leaves the question open. So that is something I was wondering if we could maybe discuss. Thank you for the lecture.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Dunja. Yes, you're right. That's a very important question. If you could just remind me of the first question. So plants, minerals, and yeah, okay. Ibn Arabi does talk about it more, perhaps not so extensively, but in the Kitab al-Ajwiba, في شرح النصائح اليوسفية or something like that. In the Kitab al-Ajwiba, he does get into it a bit more, and he will talk about the knowledge that a mountain has. And so he will discuss that mountain's knowledge with regard to a passage in the Quran when Musa alayhi salam faints, when the mountain crumbles, right? And that's a really useful passage. I think you could take a look at, and I'm happy to send you the reference. It'll take too long to explain here, but that's one example that he talks about. And then in the Futuhat, he'll occasionally touch upon the other things that you mentioned as well in specific chapters. And then with regard to the second question, that's a really good question. I'm not too sure how Ibn Arabi would view it, except to say that what is called, let's say, heresy, or what is called a diversity of different beliefs that are contradictory or contradict the Islamic dictum, are permitted to grow and foster so that God can be known in a number of ways. It's as simple as that. So that the number of beliefs could increase, because if we all lived in the quote-unquote perfect world in which there's only one correct, perfect belief, and God will only be known in one way. And that's not the purpose of creation, because he says that I love to be known. That's a beloved Sufi hadith, of course, the hadith of the treasure chest. I love to be known, so I made the world in order to know me, but God can't be known in one way. So in order for him to be known in all his modalities, the heresy, quote-unquote heresy, would need to exist. This is, of course, the ontological imperative of ontological diversity.
Thank you for the comment. Thank you so much also for the lecture. And as a conclusion, just one final last praise. Another thing that I appreciate very, very much from the book is the precision, the laser sharp precision and focus, which makes a difference between religious pluralism that Ibn Arabi approves of and tolerates, and that one that he does not. It's brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, last but not least, Professor Rizvi. Yeah.
Thank you. I should also say that I can't be held responsible for anything that Faris has written, whether the good or the bad. Let's put it this way. He was a wonderful student to supervise because he didn't really need much supervision. So just a couple of things. And I guess they're both kind of big questions which are difficult to resolve, but I'll just put them out there, not necessarily expecting an answer. One is the question of influence. I mean, where is Ibn Arabi getting this stuff from? I am not of the opinion that Ibn Arabi is an ex nihilo thinker. I think that's one of the biggest problems with Akbarian studies, is this kind of massive excessive praise for this kind of almost cosmic thinker, and that doesn't make any sense. You know, he's not a manifestation of the divine in that sense. So there must be something, you know, about where is this coming from. There must be an element of some influences and And I don't mean influence in a simple way that he just takes something and repeats it, but rather he takes something and works with it, because that's the way I think it mostly works. And the second one, I guess, is a more difficult one, which is, so what do we really make of this? I mean, who is this writing for? How are we supposed to make sense of it? How do we take it from this sort of intellectual, nice, cozy exercise of saying, oh, wow, this is quite kind of interesting, and it's really hermeneutics is neat and everything. What does it actually mean in practice? So how do we take this into interpersonal relationships? And I think that's the difficult one, not least because to throw something out, which I guess Lipton probably would throw something out, like would be how do you avoid an ethical implication of this lapsing into what is known as liberal theologizing?
Of course.
So I think that's the really difficult question is, what really is this? How do we make sense of these writings? Who is it for? And then how do we bring it into some sort of reality of praxis and the everyday and the interpersonal? Yeah, and that's really the only thing I wanted to raise. There's many other things we can talk about. We've talked about this for years, so it doesn't really matter. We'll leave it to others if they'd like to raise questions. Thank you.
Yeah,
I had a question.
Is there comments or question? Want to add something?
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much, Professor. Those are obviously brilliant questions. And yes, I think I'll start with the second one. In some ways, I wrote the book for myself. In some ways, because there are obvious practical implications to what you're saying as well. And this is a question that came up in my Viva, if you remember it, as to why was I interested in this topic to begin with. And one of the things that I've mentioned, and I will mention now, is because when I was growing up, we were not equipped with the tools in which to approach other religions and discuss things or talk to them or interact with them, because like I grew up in Dubai. So what that means is that in my school, at least 50% of the school attendees were from India and the subcontinent, right? Well, then we took religious classes in Islam, and we were given not a very sophisticated way of perceiving other religions, which I think is quite problematic if you want to interact with other people in a very meaningful manner. So I think this book can enable people to interact with, or Muslims, for example, not just Muslims, but let's take Muslims for an example. As an example, it may equip Muslims with a better way to interact with other religions in a very deeply meaningful manner that does not compromise in their own identity, but also enables them to better appreciate the place in which some other people are coming from. I'm not a fan of proselytizing people that much. And I think this book gives people a reason to not necessarily feel like they're impelled to proselytize and just appreciate who other people are, for example. Sometimes people even get existential anxiety. I'm hoping this book helps them with that existential anxiety when it comes to dealing with people of other faiths. Of course, there are Muslims who have no such existential anxiety whatsoever, and that's totally fine. But there's another group who do, and I'm hoping that would help them with regard to dealing and interacting with other people for so many reasons. Even if like people are taught about a rather rigid interpretation of how Islam perceives the salvific value of other religions, some people find these answers to be really meaningful and helpful for them personally, even if they're not talking about interacting with other people from other religions. Could you just remind me about your first question?
It was about the question of influence, or what might
Yes.
reading, which
Yes.
I mean, some of these, partly because some of these things are clearly constructions. I mean, I actually think the Shamsiyah stuff is completely constructed. I don't think it's true at all. I think this is it might have been something that he experienced in Alam al-Mithal, as they say, but it certainly isn't something which was real, because I don't think you would have come across people like that at his time.
Yes.
But I mean, it might have been he read about it in some way, but that's not the only thing. There's so much in his work which clearly must come from somewhere. apart from the ones which he explicitly cites. So we know about the explicit citations of Andalusi Sufis. We clearly know about the explicit citations of stuff like Ghazali and of peace stuff. But I'm thinking beyond that.
Yeah, there's no question that you are absolutely correct. And we would be wrong to simply assume that he obtains much of this material from himself. You'll remember that in the last chapter, I wasn't able to talk about in this presentation. The question of Al-Farabi comes up, right? Because our viewers and listeners may be interested to know that Ibn Arabi picks up a copy of Madinat al-Fadila and just tosses it to the side and thinks, nah, this is like kind of rubbish, right? But then you read some of his other passages and he's influenced by Al-Farabi without a question. And this is to do with a passage on someone he calls Aql Zamanihi, the rational spiritual thinker of his age, who was permitted to invent laws. And he says whether that includes slaying or beating or fining individuals in order to to construct a social order, right? In order to prevent chaos from disseminating. Where does he get slaying and beating and fines from? Like monetary fines? Because that's not in the Sharia, right? So Professor Sajjad will also know this. That comes from Al-Farabi's translation of Plato's laws. جوامع تلخيص نواميس إفلاطون. It's a translation of Plato's laws, and then I went to the actual laws themselves and found the passages in the Stephanus pages. But the point being, Al-Farabi, this comes from Al-Farabi's translation of the Nawamis. So how did he get access to that, or an intermediary in between that? That's a very interesting question. But that's just one answer to your question, of course. As you said, a lot of this material will come from somewhere else as well, no doubt.
All right, other questions? Do you have comments? Okay, so we can just like move briefly to the participants. I think that Jacob, you have a question or? Yeah.
Hello. Yes, I had a question. How did it for Dr. Faldi here? I pronounced your name right?
Yeah, Faris. Yeah, Faris had.
Okay. Okay. Hi, I'm Jacob. I'm from the US, from Orlando, Florida. And I had a question. How do you not feel isolated from your beliefs? Because the more unique you are, the more isolated you feel, you know?
You mean isolate from people or from myself?
I mean, like from the majority, like if you wanted to find a wife or something with these kind of beliefs, honestly, you probably wouldn't be able to find it so easily, if I may not sugarcoat it so easily.
My wife was very generous.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know you were married,
No.
but I meant like anyone else.
No. It's a very interesting question. My wife will probably laugh at the question. Yeah, I have presented my views in research, if you like, in other places like Jordan. There's a hunger for this material. So I'm not isolated in that respect. There are people who want to know about this material. So that's been good. And if I think that there are places that would not receive this material well, I just don't talk about it, because there's more than one way to relate to someone, right?
Okay.
You can not necessarily talk about this stuff all the time.
Oh, okay. Thanks for your answer.
All right, thank you. Next question, Jeffrey Hughes.
Yeah, thank you so much. I wanted to kind of get your thoughts about how you see these arguments about religious pluralism maybe figuring into Ibn Arabi's later reception, right? So as an anthropologist, I don't actually know anything about the texts themselves. I basically encounter them through modern day people, and they're often erroneous ideas, right? But Ibn Arabi seems to have this association with kind of monism, pantheism even. And in some ways, as I'm hearing this, right, you're providing a more complicated picture, right, of how, sort of he could be used, say in apologetic context, right, to kind of reconcile Islam and even polytheism, right, as in that kind of possibly, kind of faked example of, kind of him encountering the sun worshippers in Anatolia, right, which would itself obviously in some ways be a kind of very proto-ethnographic thing to do, make up the story that you need to kind of prove your anthropology, right? You have to find the kind of proto monotheism, kind of the kernel in shirk, right? And he has that example. And then thinking about how that feeds into this more general idea of wahdatul wujud, and especially that combination between creation and creator, right? Which then, when I think about how a lot of people who are, for instance, uncomfortable about Ibn Arabi, kind of it's oftentimes that, kind of creation and creature thing becomes a real kind of flashpoint, right, in the tradition. So I'm wondering, though, sort of to what degree do you think that these sort of latter day debates that are inspired by Ibn Arabi are actually, sort of fairly grounded in his text? And to what degree do you think people are kind of taking his ideas and then kind of running with them in kind of erroneous ways?
Okay. Very interesting. I mean, there is a school of Akbarian thought, right? I think the actual scholars, whoever they are from pre-modern times, have understood his thought quite well. And then there's modern phenomena as well. People who read the more hippie-esque passages, like when he says, "My heart is capable of all forms of receiving this, that, and the other, the tablets of the Torah," and so on and so forth. That's probably one way of people have misunderstood him as being a bit too hippie-like, for example. But the people who delve into the subject quite deeply, I think they've got some grasp over who he is. He tends to also, I think, be misunderstood by his perhaps admiring polemicists, people who want to critique him and his school of thought. That's pre-modern and modern. They don't tend to have a good grasp over his writings or his concepts and ideas because they are quite difficult and require a lot of nuance and familiarity. Getting to grips with his writings is hard in the beginning, but once you get into it, it's not too hard to see where he takes them and where he's going with them. So if you don't put in the effort to familiarize yourself with his thought, then you are probably susceptible to misunderstanding his writings, especially the more polemical and polemically minded individuals who maybe latch onto an incorrect initial impression of his writings.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Yeah, Mena, do you want to unmute? I think we'll just have time for 1 or 2 questions. I mean, Faris has been talking for more than 2 hours, so we need to have mercy on him. Yeah, Mena,
Sure.
yeah, do you want? Yeah.
No, I was actually curious about the question that was posed before. So my question was, how does علم اللدني that Ibn Arabi emphasizes as a source of his knowledge interplay with Sajjad's question on the sources of Ibn Arabi's knowledge? And actually, I'm curious to unpack both the question that was posed and where is it coming from, and also the possibility of of the answer.
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I wouldn't know where to begin, because obviously, as an academic, like, how am I supposed to know what's Andalusian and what's not? What we can do is take a look at what he claims things are, what he claims things, sources of knowledge he derives from are Laduni, and then maybe investigate that and see if he gets them from somewhere else or not. But I think like he'll talk about his writings like in a very general manner. He says like this is divine inspiration and it comes from ilm laduni, but he won't point to like specific examples. I think like it could be that the doctrines that he is espousing might fit what he understands to be from ilm laduni, but then like the pieces of the puzzle that he uses to express those feelings, sentiments, and ideas come from different places, like pieces of a puzzle, or like a melange of different pieces that he then brings together in order to express his views. I mean, there's no doubt that there's much of him that is unique. As Professor Sajjad said, that we ought to be quite careful. Like he's not all unique. But that's such an interesting question. I probably have to think about it a bit more. But thank you for asking it.
Yes, I see Professor Rizvi also answering on the chat. Yeah, the question was also for Professor Rizvi. Do you want to also answer? Or?
No, I mean, obviously, it's really difficult to tell. And sometimes what happens in the later tradition is that they try and elaborate what might be behind this. So better commentaries do that. But yeah, I mean, you can't get away from the fact that he's claiming, for example, the fusus was given to him by the Prophet.
Yeah.
I mean, he's not kind of stepping back from that claim. And there's many aspects, of course, of the fusus which are, I mean, to put it mildly, bizarre in the context it arises. But that's not true of all his work. So you know, my point about influence was not to kind of reduce someone to that, but just to say that, you know, across someone's oeuvre, there's always going to be, you know, creative readings of others. And you know, Faris gave the example of Farabi. Another area where you know, people have talked about is his engagement with various Sufis in Andalusia. Another area is the reception of Neoplatonism and whether you call it Ismaili or broadly kind of Shia thought in Andalusia. And another one which is very obvious is Ghazali, which surprisingly people have not written about, which is kind of odd in some ways. Reception of Ghazali or some of the really major figures of what you might call Eastern Sufism are also very much present in Ibn Arabi as well. So
just to add to that, because I didn't talk about it in the book or dissertation, because that's a whole field study in itself, but his reference to Maqasid al-Sharia, right, and usul al-fiqh, there's a whole tradition behind that. He obviously didn't get it from himself, and that goes back to Imam Juwayni, Imam Ghazali, Fakhruddin Razi, and many more individuals.
And the fact that Maqasid took off big time amongst the Malikis makes a lot of sense as well.
Yes.
So, I mean, by his time, it's almost probably only the Malikis who are really talking about Maqasid in a serious way. So that makes a lot of sense.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so last question by Sana Azmat. Do you want to unmute?
Thank you so much. This was truly a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm a very I would say I'm starting to understand Ibn Arabi, but clearly nowhere close to your amazing interpretation. My question is more of a practical kind. You mentioned abrogation, that the Mohammedan law abrogates the previous divinely revealed laws, and then in that sense, it kind of also encapsulates it. But in what does it mean in terms of a very, like let's say if we are talking about a particular ruling that has been abrogated, that is clearly at odds with those other religions. I'm talking about the religions of the book, let's say Christianity or Judaism. In that sense, that clear contradiction, how do we deal with it practically? And what would Ibn Arabi say about that? If you let's say you have a friend you were talking to a friend, and that friend follows that ruling, and your belief as a Muslim is clearly in contradiction to that. From Ibn Arabi's point of view, how would he answer that?
Sorry, would you mind just repeating the question again, please?
Yeah. So my question is that from a practical point of view, if there's a divine ruling which is clearly in opposition to the previous divine, how would Ibn Arabi react to that? How would should you just accept that other ruling which was abrogated, just as a kind of a unique self-disclosure of God in that particular ruling? Or
sure thing. I mean, so it's hard to answer that question without knowing like a specific example of what you're
let's say we're talking about alcohol. Sorry to cut you off.
Alcohol.
Let's say, just the question of alcohol, thinking of the top of my head.
Yes. Right. I'd go back to the works of the fuqaha to see what they say about that, because he would do the same thing, right? But just on a basic level, the permission to drink alcohol is permitted in the law of Christ. I think he would have possibly mentioned that in chapter 36. I'd have to go back and double check, right? So it's permissible for them to drink it, even though that their law is abrogated. It does not mean that their ahkam disappear completely, right? It just needs a mechanism by which it can be practiced within the Muhammadan Sharia. So it would be permissible for Christians to drink alcohol. And then there's the more legalistic, obviously, discussions about whether people of the book can drink alcohol or not. And, you know, it's interesting to read those discussions in which it's mentioned that they are allowed to drink alcohol and buy and sell amongst themselves within an Islamic state, for example. But you know, the way Ibn Arabi frames it is a slightly different. We don't have to go into Tajalliyat. We don't have to do that because he's a jurist himself. So he would have a juristic answer to that question. But abrogation does not mean that their ahkam just disappear. It just means how is it applied to the Muhammadan law, for example. So when they pay, for example, so just a small example, when they pay the jizya, historically speaking, they can apply their ahkam, right? Now that the jizya is abolished, right? Their religions don't just disappear, right? I would say that they're just simply practicing what is permissible in their religion, right? Yeah, that's what it seems like to me. And then you can move on to more modern questions as to like how is this applied in a modern Islamic state. But I think that's a more complicated question to answer.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks again. So I think it's time to wrap up. So yeah, thank you again, Dr. Faris, and to the panelists for helping with the discussion, and thanks all for coming. And inshallah, we'll have other seminars in the future, and yeah, we'll keep you in touch via email. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone, and bye. Yeah. Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Good night. Thank you. Bye-bye.